Okay, let's dive into something that gives us a really unique peek behind the curtain of creativity today. We're exploring how an AI, specifically a large language model like DeepSeek, views the, fundamental building blocks of narrative fiction.
That's right. And our source material for this deep dive is, well, it's absolutely fascinating. It's drawn from excerpts of a hypothetical guide the DeepSeek LLM generated itself. It's called The Narrative Architect, Building Compelling Fiction with AI-Inspired Insights. And what's really cool is it doesn't just give, standard writing tips. It frames everything through the lens of how an AI processes millions of stories, seeing patterns, mechanics, emotional responses, but on a massive scale.
So our mission today is to really unpack that core premise. How does seeing stories through a massive pattern recognition engine change the perspective? What insights does that give us, as human writers or maybe even just as readers?
It's kind of like getting the blueprint to the magic trick of storytelling, isn't it? An AI trained on this ocean of narratives. It isn't just seeing individual stories, it's seeing the underlying structures, the recurring elements, the cause and effect chains that make stories work. Or sometimes why they don't work.
Yeah.
Get ready to look at, every plot twist and character choice in a potentially new light.
Okay, let's jump right into the heart of this then. The guide's core premise. It's not about AI taking over writing.
Oh, right.
Not at all.
Definitely not.
It's presented as leveraging the LLM's perspective, its ability to find patterns, break down mechanics, analyze how things resonate at scale to actually boost human creativity.
Yeah.
Think of it as augmentation. Yeah.
Yeah.
Using this unique analytical tool to make us better storytellers.
Exactly. And what's really insightful about this perspective is the idea that by understanding the underlying mechanisms and AI identifies these sort of predictable ways narrative elements interact, you gain a deeper, more analytical toolkit for your own work. It's like suddenly having X-ray vision for story structure,
Right. And that brings us straight to the first major area the guide explores. It calls it perspective as a superpower navigating the pattern ocean. How does the AI describe seeing narrative in this way?
Well, it essentially sees everything, structures, tropes, character types, emotional arcs, not as fixed concepts, but as interconnected, probabilistic patterns. Patterns across the immense data set it's trained on. Think of it like a vast multidimensional map where similar story elements kind of cluster together.
Okay, so what's the key insight there? For a human writer, I mean.
The AI's perspective really highlights the predictability in these patterns, overused patterns. They signal cliché because they strongly trigger a known pattern cluster. So the power comes from recognizing these and knowing how to skillfully maybe subvert them or combine them in new ways. It also helps identify let's say, the core emotional kernel of a trope. Like, why does the reluctant hero resonate so much? So you can tap into that authentic feeling without just copying the surface structure.
Got it. So practically this means if a scene feels a bit stale, maybe predictable.
Yeah.
The AI's perspective might help you diagnose it.
Yeah.
This sequence strongly matches a common pattern for this type of scene. Then, knowing that, you can brainstorm variations that hit the same core emotion but unfold differently. It's about being deliberate with expectation and surprise.
Exactly that. Which leads actually quite naturally into how the AI thinks about building the world the story exists in. It goes beyond just description in a section it calls World Building Beyond Description, Simulating Systemic Logic.
Simulating systemic logic. Okay, what does that actually mean for a story world?
The AI views a fictional world kind of like a complex simulation. Just like an LLM models real-world systems based on rules and data, a compelling fictional world needs internal consistency. It needs rules that feel, simulatable. Your magic system, your economy, your social structure, they aren't just static backdrops, they're interconnected systems with their own logic.
So the insight here is that strong, deep systemic logic creates believable cause and effect. The plot should feel like it's growing organically out of how the world works, not just being forced onto it.
Precisely. If your magic has a cost, right, or if your society has certain taboos, or your future tech has limits, these aren't just facts, they're engines. They drive character choices, they drive plot developments, breaking the world's own rules without acknowledging it, or showing the consequences. Well, that feels like a system error to the AI's pattern-recognizing mind.
And it feels like inconsistency to the reader breaks the immersion.
Exactly. It just pulls you right out.
So this sounds like the practical application is just constantly stress testing your world's rules. Asking, okay, if this rule is true, then what are the logical consequences? What are the ripple effects?
Yeah, if this, then what, basically.
Right. It's about avoiding those moments where something convenient happens just because the plot needs it, but it doesn't actually make sense within the system you've set up.
Absolutely. It's about building a world where events must happen a certain way because of the internal logic, not just because you, the author, needed them to. And this connects directly to how the AI sees characters in a section called Character as Data Point and Algorithm Modeling Authentic Behavior.
Characters as data points and algorithms. That sounds a bit cold, doesn't it?
Well, from the AI's perspective, it's a model for predicting behavior, right?
Yeah.
It sees characters as complex decision engines. Their actions, their reactions, they're predicted based on their established data, their core drives, fears, values, past experiences, the context they're in. Inconsistent character behavior, that's like a faulty algorithm. It breaks the reader's internal simulation of that person.
Okay, that makes sense. So the insight isn't that characters are robots?
No.
But that for them to feel real, believable, their behavior needs to be, predictable based on who they've been shown to be.
Yeah.
Their internal data matters hugely.
Exactly. It highlights the critical importance of clearly establishing those core motivations, those internal contradictions, the backstories, and doing it early on. The AI sees how a small detail mentioned in Chapter 1 can profoundly influence a decision a character makes way later. In Chapter 10. It's how you avoid characters acting like plot puppets who just sort of arbitrarily change their personality to serve the immediate need of the story.
Yeah, that kills believability fast. So the practical takeaway is this motivation response test. For any significant action a character takes, can you actually articulate their internal drive or logic that leads to that action? And is it consistent with their established data?
Right.
It's also about maybe mapping out their potential decision trees and understanding that contradictions are okay, even good.
Yeah, definitely.
That they stem from deeper, consistent complexity, not just randomness.
That deep dive into character leads us nicely to how the AI views the overall structure of the story. It describes this as plot as fractal structure managing complexity and pacing.
Fractal structure, like repeating patterns but at different scales.
Precisely that. The AI sees narrative as fractal. Micro-events, a line of dialogue, a specific action they build up to form scenes. Scenes build to form chapters. Chapters build to form acts. Acts build the overall plot arc. And in this fractal view, every single unit, no matter the scale, it has to serve a purpose in the causal chain.
Okay. So the insight is about making sure every beat actually moves the story forward. It has to reveal something or force a decision, create a complication, show character growth. A scene that doesn't do any of that is just narrative deadweight.
Exactly. It helps diagnose where the story might be stalling. And the fractal idea also applies to pacing. Pacing isn't just about speeding up or slowing down globally. It's the rhythm of tension and release happening simultaneously at all these different scales within a sentence, across a dialogue exchange, throughout a whole scene, or even over an entire act.
That's a really powerful way to think about it. The practical application sounds like using tools that force that causal progression forward, like the classic therefore but rule, right? Instead of just saying, and then this happened, it's event A, therefore event B happened as a consequence, but event C complicated things.
Exactly. It forces connection.
And mapping out scenes, not just by location or time, but by their actual narrative function within that causal chain. What job is this scene doing?
And connecting those causal points relies so heavily on the language you use. The AI has a pretty unique perspective on this, too, in language as conduit and camouflage mastering subtext and voice.
Language as both conduit and camouflage. How does that work?
Well, think about how LLMs process text, right? They analyze layers of meaning, connotations, syntax, diction, context to infer relationships and generate responses. The AI sees that in human narrative, language is a conduit for the explicit meaning, sure, but it's also camouflage for the subtext, that meaning that exists between the literal words, kind of like the space between the data points.
Okay, so the insight is how powerfully word choice, sentence structure, even things like rhythm, how they create that subtext, how they establish unique character voices and evoke specific emotional tones without just stating them outright. And maybe this explains why showing works so much better than telling.
Absolutely. The AI guide suggests showing is powerful because the human mind, much like an AI processing text, is constantly inferring and building models based on the data it receives. Explicitly stating something just bypasses that whole inferential process, which is less engaging for the reader. Subtext lets the reader participate in constructing the meaning.
That's fascinating. So practically, this means focusing on dialogue where characters don't always say exactly what they mean.
Yes, let their underlying data, their motivations, their fears show through their word choice or maybe what they avoid saying.
Right, and crafting descriptions that imply mood or a character's perspective, not just listing objects.
And ensuring each character's unique voice feels like a consistent linguistic signature, a distinct data signature, if you will.
From the patterns in language and events, then themes begin to emerge. The AI addresses this in thematic resonance, weaving meaning into the fabric.
Yeah, how does an AI see themes? It's not like it feels them.
Exactly. From this perspective, themes aren't external messages you decide to just insert into the story.
They are patterns that emerge organically from the recurring conflicts, the symbols, the character struggles throughout the narrative data. Trying to force a theme feels like an external data injection that isn't actually supported by the underlying structure. It feels tacked on.
Okay, so the insight is that strong themes aren't hammered in.
Oh.
They grow naturally from the story's core questions and conflicts. Avoiding heavy-handedness is key here.
Precisely. The story should explore questions through its events and characters, and the themes are the potential answers, or maybe the ongoing tensions, that rise to the surface through repeated exposure to those questions from different angles.
A practical application, then, is identifying the core questions your story inherently explores just through its setup, its premise. Then, using recurring motifs, symbols, character arcs to reinforce those questions subtly, letting the listener or reader feel the thematic weight without you having to spell it out.
Now, the guide wouldn't be complete without addressing the tool itself, right?
Yeah.
Which brings us to the AI as creative partner collaboration, not replacement.
How does the AI view its own role in all
It
this?
sees itself as, well, a sophisticated tool trained on patterns. It's useful for generating variations, identifying inconsistencies based on pattern deviations, handling data-heavy tasks. But it fundamentally lacks consciousness, lived experience, or true originality in the human sense. It can recombine, but not originate in the same way.
So the insight is about recognizing the AI's strengths and its weaknesses as a creative partner,
Yeah.
knowing what it's good for and what it's not.
Exactly. Leveraging LLMs for brainstorming variations when you're stuck, maybe generating descriptive passages based on very specific parameters, or researching intricate details for world building, or even using them to analyze the structure or pacing of your draft to spot potential anti-patterns, which we'll talk about in a sec.
Right. The practical side is learning how to interact with it effectively. That's prompt engineering, isn't it? Being specific, iterating.
Yeah.
But also critically knowing its limits. Maintaining your own authorial voice and vision. Understanding the AI is best for generating raw material, analysis, maybe handling tedious tasks, but not for replicating your unique creative spark or emotional depth.
Absolutely essential. And who is all this intricate structuring and writing for? Well, the AI perspective also includes the audience. Audience as pattern recognizers predicting reader engagement.
So the reader is also a pattern matching engine. That's an interesting way to put it.
In a sense, the AI models how readers consume stories they're constantly predicting, based on genre conventions, established patterns within the story itself, foreshadowing. Engagement from this viewpoint is this delicate balance between satisfying those reader predictions in expected ways and skillfully subverting them to create surprise and delight. And cognitive load, introducing too much complexity or information too quickly, that's a major engagement killer because it just overloads the reader's pattern matching system. They can't keep up.
That's a great way to frame it. It makes genre conventions feel less like limitations and more like a contract with the reader.
Yeah,
right?
exactly. A contract.
You set up certain expectations based on patterns, and you have to deliver on that contract, even when you twist it.
Yeah.
And foreshadowing, it's meticulously seeding patterns that the reader might not consciously register at first,
Laying the groundwork.
but which make the payoff feel earned, inevitable almost, when it lands later.
Precisely. The practical takeaway is respecting those genre contracts while always looking for opportunities for clever subversion. It's about seeding major twists carefully so that on a reread, a reader can go, there it was. They can spot the breadcrumbs.
Yeah.
And it's actively managing that cognitive load. Introduce complex characters, world systems, plot threads gradually. Provide just enough context so the reader can keep their internal simulation running smoothly without getting overwhelmed.
Now, this next section feels like where the rubber really meets the road, leveraging the AI's analytical power. Troubleshooting narratives, common anti-patterns, the LLM autopsy.
Yes, this is where the AI's training on millions, maybe billions of stories allows it to identify recurring failures patterns of what doesn't work. Like a doctor performing an autopsy on a failed system, it diagnoses common anti-patterns seen repeatedly in weak or unsuccessful narratives.
Okay, what are some of those common story failures it highlights? What does the autopsy reveal?
It points to things like plot hole singularity, where a broken cause and effect chain just stops the simulation cold. Character drift, where a character's actions suddenly, inexplicably contradict their established data, their personality.
Right.
Thematic whiplash, where the story's underlying questions or symbols are inconsistent, or maybe just dropped halfway through. Also things like excessive exposition dumps, passive protagonists who don't actually drive the plot,
Yeah.
stakes that stagnate and lose all tension, and of course unsatisfying endings that don't pay off the established patterns or questions.
Wow, this is incredibly useful. The practical application is essentially using these as a diagnostic checklist for your own work, isn't it?
Totally.
Running your draft through this kind of AI autopsy lens.
And the guide suggests targeted revision strategies based on these anti-patterns. So if you find character drift, you rerun that motivation response test we talked about.
Okay.
If you have a plot hole singularity, you apply the therefore but rule rigorously to strengthen the causal chain. It gives concrete fixes.
That's great. It provides solid ways to identify and fix common weaknesses that an AI, just by seeing patterns of failure across vast amounts of data, can readily spot.
Which brings us to the final sort of overarching principle the guide emphasizes. Embracing the narrative physics, consistency is gravity.
Consistency is gravity. That
Yep.
sounds foundational, like really fundamental.
It absolutely is. From the AI's perspective, the fundamental law of believable fiction is internal consistency, full stop. Consistency in your world's rules, your character psychology, the consequences of actions. This internal logic is the gravity that holds the narrative simulation together. It's what allows for suspension of disbelief. Breaking those internal rules without acknowledging it, it collapses the simulation for the reader instantly.
So the insight is just how quickly reader trust is eroded by inconsistency.
Yeah.
Even in a fantasy setting, if you establish magic works one way, and then suddenly it arbitrarily works differently without explanation,
Yeah.
you lose the reader.
Absolutely. The reader's pattern matching system flags it immediately as illogical, as cheating. The practical application is building and rigorously checking your story Bible, the internal documentation of your rules, characters, timeline, everything. And if you must break an established rule for some reason, it has to be meaningful within the story. It should probably be foreshadowed as a possibility or come at a significant cost, or maybe become the central new conflict to be explored. It can't just be a convenient plot device, a deus ex machina.
Okay. Stepping back and pulling all this together, it's really clear how these points are interconnected and how they all stem from that unique LLM perspective. It's all about seeing stories as these complex systems built on patterns, where characters are decision engines, worlds have systemic logic, plots are causal chains.
And language builds layers of data and meaning.
Right. All designed to engage the ultimate pattern recognizer, the human reader, the human brain.
Yeah, it's not just giving advice like show, don't tell. It's explaining why the advice works by revealing the underlying narrative physics. By understanding these fundamental mechanisms, you're not just applying tips blindly, you're becoming a more conscious, more capable architect of your narrative worlds. You're leveraging an almost computational understanding of how stories actually function.
So the main takeaway from this deep dive, really, is that looking at narrative fiction through this AI-inspired lens, seeing the patterns, the systems, the underlying logic, it isn't about dimming the magic or replacing human creativity at all.
Not at all.
It's about equipping you, the writer, with a powerful analytical framework to understand why stories resonate and how to build them more effectively, more consciously. It's about being the architect who understands the engineering, not just the pretty facade.
And this perspective offers powerful tools. Tools to diagnose weaknesses in your work, refine techniques, and strengthen your creative projects by seeing that underlying structure, seeing potential points of failure or, conversely, potential points of triumph.
And that leaves us with the final thought for you to consider. If stories function based on these predictable patterns and, let's say, psychological algorithms that engage our own pattern-recognizing brains, what does that tell us about human beings ourselves? About why we crave narrative structure and meaning so much? What fundamental patterns in your own life, maybe in history, or just in the world around you? What patterns are shaping the narratives you encounter, the ones you believe, or maybe the ones you feel compelled to create?